So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marty West. I'm Academic Dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to Education Now. With 3 weeks to go until the 2024 election, education policy watchers in the U.S. have their eyes on the state of Massachusetts, where voters are preparing to weigh in on a high-profile ballot question that would change the requirements for high school graduation. The election is local to Massachusetts, but the state's status as a trendsetter on education policy will give the outcome national significance. It also provides an opportunity to take a broader look at state policies governing which students receive diplomas, how those policies have evolved over time, and what they mean for students and educators. And we have an outstanding panel assembled to do just that. We also want you to be part of the conversation as well. So please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, which is also where you can find access to closed captioning. So let's get started now by welcoming our guests. First up is Ann Heislip. Ann is a former senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Education and the current director of policy development at All for Ed, a national nonprofit working to ensure that all students graduate high school prepared for college, work, and life. We also have John Pape, Associate Professor of Education and Director of the Annenberg Institute at Brown University, also, I'm proud to say, an alum of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And then finally, we have my colleague Irvin Scott, a senior lecturer here at HGSE, who spent more than 20 years working as a teacher, principal, administrator, and foundation officer before joining our faculty. Irvin and John, thanks to each of you for joining us. So
Thank you for having us.
Let's start with you,
Thanks,
Ann.
Marty.
Since 2003, Massachusetts students have been required to pass standardized tests in math, reading, and science in order to receive a diploma. Ballot question 2 would eliminate this requirement so that students would need to meet only their local district standards in order to graduate. One of the common talking points we've been hearing in the debate in Massachusetts is that the state is now just one of only 9 states that currently uses an exit exam to regulate high school graduation, but that wasn't always the case. Can you help us understand how and why exit exam policies have evolved over time?
Thanks so much, Martin. Yeah, I think that is exactly right. Exit exam policies have evolved, but I do think it's important to note that the reasons for implementing them have not evolved. First, there was a goal of just increasing K-12 student achievement by setting clearer standards for high school learning and then motivating students to meet those standards. And second, states adopted exit exams to improve students' post-secondary success and give colleges and future employers a clear signal that graduates possessed valuable skills. But the exit exams, sort of as we know them, they came up in the 1970s. But I would say that at the time, they really measured basic skills. We're talking middle school level, not the type of assessments we think about today when they're associated with exit exams. And 40 years ago, about 20 states had this kind of minimum competency test. That shifted in the 1980s with the publication of A Nation at Risk, this concern of a rising tide of mediocrity, and the whole standards-based reform and accountability movement. So as standards-based reform took off, exit exams kind of evolved alongside that, and really sort of culminated at their peak with No Child Left Behind in 2001. And that was right around the time that Massachusetts adopted its exit exam policy in 2003. So by about 2012, half of states had exit exams policies in place as part of their bigger sort of accountability scheme for K-12 education. I would note, though, in 2010, that is when states once again came together to say, we need to raise the bar. We have these standards in place, but they actually aren't aligned with post-secondary expectations. So you saw states begin to develop college and career-ready standards through the Common Core initiative. And with that, new tests to measure those skills. And at the time, sort of felt like if we set the bar on our exit exam aligned with this more rigorous standard, far too many students will fail and then we will not graduate them. So at that point, we really saw states starting to rethink or walk away from their exit exam policies entirely. By 2017, half of states had abandoned their exit exam policies entirely. So you went from half of states in 2012 to sort of 50% of those were out by 2017. It doesn't mean that today's graduation requirements exclude assessments, but as states moved away from a more traditional exit exam, they often created multiple pathways or options for earning diplomas. And sort of today we have maybe roughly half of states look at competency in some form or fashion, but it just doesn't take the shape of a traditional exit exam like in Massachusetts.
So the question facing Massachusetts voters is whether they want to join that trend that we've seen in a number of other states. Now, John, you and your colleagues at the Annenberg Institute recently released a report that attempts to ground the current debate in evidence on how the MCAS graduation requirement has worked in the state. Can you give us a few highlights from that report, what you see as the most important and potentially the most surprising data points?
Yeah, thanks, Marty. We've been doing work in partnership with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and Department of Higher Education for about a decade now. And we've been studying these exit exams over the over that time. And this new report tries to summarize all of the things that we found. So, a couple points that stood out to us. Maybe they're not surprising, but we thought they're important for this debate. Are one, historically, the two main measures of high school success, MCAS scores and course grades, have both predicted outcomes like college graduation and later earnings. And that's true even if we compare demographically similar students who attend the same high school. So in other words, these MCAS scores and course grades both provide important but somewhat different information about students' skills. The second is that over the past decade, high school grades in Massachusetts have risen substantially, while test scores, both on the MCAS and on the low-stakes National Assessment of Educational Progress, have fallen. Chronic absenteeism has risen. In fact, the share of students who earn an A in their high school courses in Massachusetts is close to double since 2011. I think the third point that we would highlight is that while most students, pass the test on their first attempt, nearly all of those who fail are English learners, are students with disabilities, and or students with inadequate course preparation as they're taking the test. And so, most of the students who initially failed at least one of the tests do go on to retake the test and to pass it. But about 85% of students who never passed are English learners or students with disabilities.
So we'll come back to that in a moment, but I want to ask you to just explain something that may not be obvious when we talk about the exit exam requirement in Massachusetts. There are already alternative pathways built into that where students can show their competency in other ways. Is that correct? And what do those look like?
That's right. I mean, so students take the test for the first time in 10th grade, or in science, they can take it in 9th grade or 10th grade, and they have multiple opportunities to retake that test and pass it. Students can also, districts can file appeals for students based on their course grades for students who have grades that are above the average student who passed the test. And one of the things that we looked at here was how are districts filing appeals for students? And we found pretty big variation across districts, right? Districts that had a reasonable number of students who, by their senior year had not yet passed the test. In some of those districts, they filed appeals for nearly all students. In other districts, they filed appeals for very few of those students. And nearly all appeals in the state are successful. And so it does feel like there are these alternative pathways, but they aren't always fully utilized in the state.
Great. Now, Irvin, you, as I understand it, served as assistant superintendent for high schools and then as the chief academic officer in the Boston Public Schools pretty shortly after the MCAS first became a graduation requirement. How did you see the policy affecting students and educators in Boston? And how, as a leader, did you try to ensure that students and educators responded in positive ways?
Yeah, thank you, Marty. This was under the Mayor Menino administration. Dr. Carol Johnson was the superintendent at the time. And I was the high school assistant superintendent for high schools, overseeing the 20 or so high schools in Boston at the time. So I want to be clear up front. I'm a staunch supporter of requiring the MCAS for high school graduation. I was then, I am now, so I oppose question 2. When I came to BPS as the academic superintendent for high schools, there really were 2 major challenges facing high schoolers in Boston Public Schools at the time. One was a dropout crisis. High school graduation rates were lower than the national average. This challenge was elevated because of a national focus on dropout crisis across the country. And then the other challenge was inequities in access to the most rigorous courses for high school students. So if you were a high school student in 2008, you were pretty much guaranteed to get access to advanced placement, not so much international baccalaureate, but definitely advanced placement courses if you were at the exam schools. If you were the other 15 or 17 high schools, you did not necessarily even have access to advanced placement courses. So since passing the MCAS became a requirement for high school graduation in 2003, by the time I was the academic superintendent for high schools, there were those who wondered if the dropout crisis in particular was contributing, as a result of the MCAS requirement. And what we learned, and we worked with Parthenon to learn this, it wasn't necessarily the MCAS that was contributing to dropout. It was things like students in substantially separate classrooms, particularly male, African-American males in substantially separate classes, or ELL students, or ninth grade repeater students. The point being, in some ways, the fact that we were so focused on high school graduation rates and who was getting access to courses and who weren't getting access to courses, that helped to shine a light on some of the challenges that our students were faced with, including the light that comes through the MCAS. And so I get really concerned when I hear about the possibility of taking away the MCAS, because again, it shines a light on who's getting access, who has the services, who's not achieving. And I wonder to myself, do we want 300 and some school districts across the country basically turning the lights off on what's happening for high schoolers in terms of whether they're able to achieve, and then districts doing whatever they want to do in that space? And I just don't think that would serve kids well at all, based on the experience that I had when I was in Boston Public Schools.
John, Urban's concern at the time that the concerns he was hearing from others that the MCAS requirement might be leading to increases in dropout rates was a pretty widespread fear when the policy was first introduced. There was this understanding that lots more students were going to fail to complete high school as the requirement was put in place. What happened to graduation rates in the state of Massachusetts over the period when the MCAS requirement was implemented?
Yeah, we don't talk about that much in this report, but in a previous report, we looked at this in some detail. And I mean, it's hard to tell. When policies are put in place, lots of things are happening all at the same time. And so it's really hard to sort of disaggregate what's the impact of any individual policy. But around this time when the MCAS was introduced, high school completion rates were rising in Massachusetts, college going rates were rising, and test scores were rising. So there was this sort of period of improvement in all of these.
Now, and one concern that critics of question 2 have been raising is that the measure would repeal the MCAS requirement without replacing it with an alternative form of state regulation, leaving it to local districts to decide what it takes to graduate. So here in Massachusetts, the immediate choice voters face with respect to the state role is an exit exam or nothing. But other states have developed alternatives to exit exams to ensure that diplomas remain meaningful. Can you tell us about what some of those alternatives look like?
That's right. If question 2 passes, Massachusetts would still have the MCAS. High school students would still be required to take the test, but there would essentially be no statewide graduation requirements. And that's because Massachusetts is very unique among the states in not having a required set of courses that are standard for graduation. In 48 states, course requirements are the foundation of diploma standards, not assessments. So how many years of English, math, science, and so on a student needs to take to earn a diploma. So that creates, even without an exit exam, some degree of uniformity from district to district. The Mass Core high school course sequence in Massachusetts is recommended, but it's not required. So adopting some form of statewide course requirements is far and away the most common alternative to an exit exam policy. But even with those states that do still have assessments or demonstrations of competency in their graduation, there are some alternatives to the approach that Massachusetts uses. Often states are not relying on a single assessment. They may have created a menu of options for students to choose from that could look at other assessment scores that are used for college admissions or credit, like ACT, SAT, the AP or IB. Some states also look at post-secondary preparatory experiences, so earning dual enrollment credit, or completing an industry certification or licensure or a registered apprenticeship. And a few states actually let districts kind of develop performance tasks or examine portfolios of student work to see if students have mastered those competencies. Another key distinction too is that many states let students access this menu straight away. They don't have to fail the state test before they can choose one of these alternative pathways. All of these options are available to them from the get-go. And I would also say that even sort of within this menu of options, there are often particular alternatives that are specific to certain student populations, like students with significant cognitive disabilities or recently arrived English learners. I also think another kind of key distinction or alternative choice that some states have made is that their standard diploma does not include any competency demonstration. It's just based on those course requirements. And then they use sort of advanced diplomas or diploma seals or endorsements to set a really high bar on those assessments for students who want to opt into that pathway. So I think, as we kind of alluded to, on the MCAS, the graduation requirement is far below the proficiency standard. It's a standard that most students can pass, but it's not actually pegged to that college and career readiness standard. So some states have said, we're not going to require a test for all kids to graduate, but if you want to get our college and career ready diploma, you have to be proficient on the college and career ready assessment, and they can set a higher bar.
John, that provides an opportunity to jump to one of the questions I thought of asking you. In your report, you look at the long-term outcomes, including post-secondary education outcomes of those students who really just barely pass the current threshold for earning a diploma. What do we see when we look at their long-term outcomes?
I mean, I think we see exactly what Ann said, right? The students who are just barely getting over this passing threshold on the test do not seem to be well prepared for college and career, right? Very few of those students actually enroll in college. The ones that don't go on, I think it's something like, of the students who are just barely past the math test and go on to a Massachusetts public university or college and take a math class, only 14% of them are earning credit towards college graduation in that math class. The rest are failing that math class. They're in remedial coursework or otherwise not, dropping out of those classes. So I think they are not well prepared. And if we track them out to around age 30, they are not on average earning living wages in the labor market.
And so that's part of what has led some states to set a higher standard, but then do that in the context of a set of graduation requirements that provides alternatives to the exam in the way that Ann was just talking about. Irvin, coming back to you, I was interested to see recently that the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents, representing district leaders in the state, recently announced that they opposed question 2, meaning that they wanted the exit exam requirement to remain in place. And they did that on the grounds that it would repeal the current requirement without replacing it with another form of state quality assurance. I initially found that a bit surprising, since I thought that school district leaders might prefer to make their own decisions independent of state oversight. Do you, as a former district administrator, find that surprising? And should we be concerned about leaving districts to their own devices?
Well, I find it encouraging, right, that the Superintendent Association would be opposed to this change. And as I think about it, I could see it being sort of a issue of workload in some ways. Do I have the infrastructure in my school district to bring everybody together to figure out what their graduation requirements are going to be for my district? And so I could see superintendents basically saying, we already have a requirement, let's keep it there. Let's not sort of divvy it up amongst 300 superintendents, 300 districts to sort of figure it out on their own. So I think that's a very efficient way to respond. But I also see it, the reason why I say it's encouraging, because I see it as also an equity response, right? So districts, superintendents saying, you know what? I want to compare myself to other districts across the state, right? I don't want to have a different requirement for my district that I really can't see how my students are doing relative to other students in other school districts. From the perspective of students of color and other marginalized groups, I would want them to be held to the same standard that other students are being held to across the entire state. So that's why I see it as a very encouraging move on the part of the leaders that are leading these districts all across the state.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify as we have this conversation that the proposal is to get rid of the requirement that students pass the MCAS in order to graduate. It wouldn't get rid of the test itself, right? And so that information could still be available. And that test is actually required under federal law. So that's beyond what Massachusetts can decide on its own. But you're certainly right that the exit exam requirement sort of leads people to pay more attention to it. Let's turn to some questions that are coming in via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Thanks to those of you who have submitted them. John, here's one I want to sort of pose to you. It says, those who are forced to retake the test may miss out on other important courses, and many drop out rather than continue. Where do they go and what happens to them? And that's the question as submitted. I'll sort of broaden it to say many people are concerned about the sort of consequences for the educational experience students have of the sort of requirement itself, and then for students who fail to pass on their first time. So what do we know about what happens for those students?
Yeah, so the students who are failing their first time, about 2/3 of them go on, more than 2/3 go on to retake the test and pass it. Another subset of students go on and satisfy the competency determination, which is what we call sort of meeting that standard here, but through the appeals process. But there are certainly students who fail, who drop out of school, and but there are a lot of students also who just pass, who drop out of school, and so it's very hard to say, to figure out how much does sort of barely passing or failing the test affect whether students graduate from high school or not. I mean, we've done some work looking at this, and we find that there are impacts of sort of just, if you just pass instead of just fail. What's really hard to interpret, though, is, are those like students who pass, are they feeling more confident about their abilities and so they stay in school more than they otherwise would, or are students who fail prevented from, discouraged and drop out of school? I think that, but I think the bigger point is there are many factors that lead students to drop out of school. I think Irvin, you highlighted this earlier, and the MCAS may be one of those specific one of those components.
So here's another one coming in from the audience. I would like to hear someone, and that someone's going to be you, so get ready. I would like to hear someone address the question of why keeping the tests high stakes is necessary when we regard plenty of other non-high stakes test data as valid. And the reason I want you to address that is I'm curious what we know about the validity of some of the alternative approaches to sort of measuring student preparation that other states have chosen to rely on. Do we have the same type of evidence that John and his colleagues have produced that these skills really do matter for students' long-term success?
That's a really great question. I think that the answer is it depends. If your alternative is a student who has passed successfully a dual credit course, yes, there is evidence that if you take dual enrollment and you can pass that course as a high school student, you are likely going to have more successful post-secondary outcomes. But we don't have that same type of evidence for each and every option that states are putting on these menus. So, ACT scores definitely have strong evidence behind them. SAT scores, that's part of the reason why we know what a college ready benchmark is on the ACT or SAT, because the College Board and ACT have done those studies. But with, if you're doing a portfolio of work or sort of a unique district demonstration of competency, the research hasn't yet really been conducted to say that those meet the same evidence that we would think about these other measures that have been in existence for longer and have been more studied.
So I want to circle back to an observation that you made, John, which is that I believe a majority of students who ultimately do not receive a diploma because they haven't earned a passing score on the MCAS, yet have completed other local graduation requirements. A majority of students in that situation are either English learners or students with disabilities. One of the questions that came in says, what supports or options are currently in place for English language learners who do not pass the MCAS given a language barrier? Can you just tell us how the policy applies to that population and help us understand that?
Yeah, I mean, the policy applies equally to all populations in the state. We're students who the state has now a bilingual version of the test in science and in mathematics that students can take. It's translated in Spanish. They do not have versions in other languages. So that is one support that's in place for students to pass, to help them pass in mathematics and in science. I think that we find that the MCAS tests in 10th grade are less predictive of long-term outcomes for English learners, in part because their English competency is growing throughout high school. We would expect that. And so I think this is a really important question. We find that we've done a lot of work on these, particularly Anne mentioned new arrivals. We've looked at at immigrant newcomers to Massachusetts high schools who comprise about 5% of test takers in the state now, but about 25% of students who are in this category that you just mentioned, Marty, who have satisfied all of their high school requirements but have not passed the MCAS. And I think that's an important question about what to do with how to serve that group of students well.
And a parallel question about students with disabilities. Someone writes, I'd love to hear about your take on the MCAS as a requirement for students with disabilities, especially cognitive disabilities. You mentioned a little bit about how other states have thought about that topic. Do you have more to say there?
Yeah, so typically it is for students who have the most significant cognitive disabilities. And these are often students who do not take the general assessment, like the general MCAS. They take an alternate version of the MCAS or whatever state assessment they are using. And given that, they typically will then create sort of modified graduation standards that apply just to the students. They're still aligned with the state's academic standards, but it's sort of adjusted to understand that these are students who have particular academic disabilities. And then oftentimes they are looking more at portfolios of work, that sort of are representative, and there's a little bit more educator judgment in there. And I think that that's often the sort of process that states have set up for that group in particular. So we're not talking about, all students with disabilities. This is a very small subset. But it is super important. Just, I think, mentioned the point about translating the assessments into multiple languages. It's really important that all assessments are built with the accessibility features, built on universal design principles, include accommodations that can support all students with disabilities to access the content on the assessment.
Great. And I think we have time for just one more question. Irvin, I'm going to circle back to you. Again, this is submitted by a member of the audience. If schools aren't forced to teach to a test, what will be used to determine whether a student meets core competencies to graduate? Will it create the opportunity for schools to lower academic standards required to graduate, especially for students who've fallen significantly behind due to COVID interruptions?
Yeah, so I'll answer it this way. As a supporter of keeping the MCAS in its sort of high stakes nature, I think this is actually a really good point. I think what it does, it actually puts pressure on educators. It puts pressure on us as leaders to ensure that we're providing the supports for students and families and other educators to meet the needs of all students. The other thing I think that's really important, because it's a high stakes for students at the high school level, it also, they know they can't graduate without passing it. It engages the students in the learning process, right? So it's not just pressure on educators to ensure that they have the support and the families and so forth and so on. But students, they're in high school. They should be motivated to pass this exam, and taking away the sort of high stakes nature of it, I think, is problematic. Basically, it says to them they don't have to pass it in order to graduate. And whatever we can do to engage students in their learning process is healthy for them at this stage, I think.
Well, our short time has come to an end. I hope the members of the audience, especially those in Massachusetts, will consider this a appetizer and sort of dig in to learn more about the question they face. And I hope that those around the country and indeed the globe will find opportunities to engage in these questions about how we ensure the success of high school students in an equitable manner in their own context, and will find this conversation useful in doing so. Thank you all for joining us, and please join me in thanking Anne, John, and Irvin for joining me in conversation today.